Well, listen, thank you all very much for coming out here in the middle of the day. This is a new experiment for us. We've been doing job summits and workshops around the country. We started in Cincinnati and went to Jackson, Mississippi, and Orange County, California. Just did one last week in Pensacola, Florida. This is the first one we've done during the daytime, and we realized that it's much harder to get folks because most of the folks who were on our side are actually working taxpayers who, so it's a little trickier than the other team. But I appreciate your coming, and many of you I met with earlier either in a Tea Party meeting or in a small business meeting, and so I'm doubly grateful that you're here. I want to share with you some things and then really toss it open and give you a chance to talk. Now, you have two handouts, I believe, all of you should have. This is back because I used to be a teacher, and so I figure if we give you handouts, it makes it easier for you to take them home and sort of cheat sheets. The first one we got, this one that's the St. Petersburg Business publication, I thought was amazing. The St. Petersburg paper is well to the left of the New York Times. And I was surprised that they would actually put together a page on what is it going to take to create enough jobs to get America healthy again. If you'll notice, they start with the fact that we have 8,400,000 jobs that were lost since December of 2007. They then point out that you can't just replace those jobs, but that there's population growth and that you actually have to create more than the jobs that you lost. And their calculation was, if you created 292,000 new jobs every month from now until 2015, that you would get back to the employment level you had in 2007. Now, as you may know, the Wall Street Journal reported this morning that they actually had an increase in unemployment applications this last month. And so when you think of it that way, if you need to be gaining 292,000 and you're actually losing, then it gets deeper. Now, I want to make a couple key points about this because I think we haven't really had a serious national conversation about what an economic recovery is going to require. And that's part of the purpose at American Solutions of having these kind of meetings to talk about reality and to talk about the things that Washington doesn't seem to understand. We're in a situation where I believe we have to set as our number one domestic goal getting the economy growing again at a rate that gives every American an opportunity to work. And I think it is very dangerous to this country to get into the habit of thinking that as long as Congress passes extended unemployment, it's okay. I actually think it's dangerous to have people get 2 years of unemployment because that's 2 years of not actively looking for work, 2 years of not going to school and acquiring a new skill, 2 years of not being ambitious. Now, that's how we got with welfare prior to the 1996 reforms. And so I just want to start and say the Congress's attitude, look what we've done, we've now extended unemployment again, is exactly backwards. What Congress ought to be saying every morning is, what are we going to do to create jobs? And I said 6 months ago that the president ought to call James Carville and ask him for the sign that was hanging in the campaign office in Little Rock in 1992 that said, "It's the economy, stupid." And they ought to hang it in the Oval Office. And if you start from asking the question, is the next act of government going to increase the number of jobs or decrease the number of jobs? If that's your yardstick, then this administration has been the greatest disaster since Herbert Hoover. Because what they're doing on every front, from the cap and trade legislation that will be a giant energy tax and a massive increase in regulations, to the health bill, which is a giant tax increase and a massive increase in regulations, to the end of the Bush tax cuts, which will be the largest single tax increase in American history, to the degree to which they are anti-small business, to the new proposals Henry Waxman is developing, which will be even more anti-small business. I mean, you go down the list of things they're doing, and every time you turn around, They're making life harder for small businesses, harder for entrepreneurs, harder for startups, and then they're amazed. They're also failing to correct some of the most important corrections that we need to make. And I'll just give you one example. The accounting profession adopted an entirely artificial model called mark-to-market, which says the way we're going to value your property is by estimating what you would get if you sold it this afternoon. Now, the European Central Bank in 2004 said this is a disastrous idea, because what it does is it overvalues property on the way up. Because if I'm in a particular, let's say I have a hotel, and a hotel near me sells for a really high price, I can immediately revalue my hotel up. So if you're on an upward escalator in the economy, this is what was happening. Every time something sold, by definition, I'm marking to market. So gosh, mine must be worth a lot more now because the guy down the street got more money, so I'll bet I could get more money. So people had this sense of artificial wealth that was false. But if you're on a downward economy, it accelerates the pain level. Because think about this, if you're under an accounting theory called mark-to-market, and there's no market, what's the value of your property? It's zero. So you go to the bank. The bank says, well, you know, under mark-to-market rules, I can't loan you any money now because your property is worth zero. And you say to them, wait a second, I have 12 clients, they're all paying their rent, I'm paying the mortgage every month. Historically, under the rules that existed under Ronald Reagan, you wouldn't revalue my property. You'd say, okay, you're at a historic cash flow model, and you're fine. But under this is an entirely theoretical artifact of accounting professions imposing a destructive anti-economic rule. Now here's why it matters. We're going to have huge volume of commercial real estate come due in the next 6 to 9 months. Most of that commercial real estate, we're talking now hotels, shopping centers, commercial buildings, most of it's producing cash flow. Most of it's paying off its mortgage. But when they market to market, it's going to suddenly be worth 40 or 50% less than its current value. And the bank is going to say, in order for you to roll over your loan, you've got to put up 30% of the value of your property. And suddenly a person who has no great cash flow problem is going to have a crisis. I was briefed last week in St. Petersburg by some experts. I think this could become catastrophic by summer. And yet there's no evidence in Congress of anybody even understanding it. Congress should be repealing mark-to-market and allowing the application of historic cash flow principles. And you would overnight ease the economy dramatically. Now that's an example of what's going wrong. At a time when we ought to be thinking about how to help the economy recover, the people in Congress who don't have a clue about free enterprise are actually thinking about ways to hurt the economy more and make the economy weaker. I feel part of this because in my private sector role, I am a small business person. I run 4 small businesses, and we employ about 36 people. And I know that I've got to meet payroll every month. I know that we've got to take care of our customers every month. And I know that this economy for the last 2 years has been tough. And you have to run harder to stay in place. You're not running harder to get ahead. You're running harder. How many of you would agree in your own experience in the private sector that in the last 2 years you've had to run harder just to break even than you would have expected? Now, so where we are today is we ought to be taking active steps to make it easier for people to start growing, hiring people, increasing income, getting back to a productive economy. Because you don't want to live in an America where the latest number was, if you counted everybody who's unemployed, everybody who's quit looking for work, and everybody who's working part-time but wants to work full-time. This is called a U6 number, but it's a different kind. It's an underemployment plus unemployment. The number nationally is about 17.5%. In California and Michigan, it's better than 20%, which means, think about this, 1 out of every 5 Americans. Now, that's not healthy for us as a country. I mean, it's not only financially bad, but it's culturally bad. It's bad for the whole American vision of a better country, a better future, doing things for your children and grandchildren. So there's a two-part process we're developing at American Solutions. In the short run, we have a very specific package, which I'm going to walk you through in a minute, where we really try to develop an immediate program that we think, if it were adopted, and again, I'm under no illusion, the current Congress will not adopt this because the left-wingers who dominate the current Congress don't believe in free enterprise, don't believe in small business, don't believe in trying to encourage investment, don't believe in entrepreneurs, so they don't get this at all. But my hope is that by November, you could have a lot of people who understand this who get elected, who could decide by January that this is the right direction to go in. And that at the state level, you have a number of governors and state legislatures who understand this. So let me start with that. And I'll come back and talk about that in detail. But let me paint a bigger picture for a second. We have two really different challenges. One is, how do we get out of the current ongoing, really, really deep recession? And I think there are steps we can take, and I'm going to outline them for you in a minute. But the other is, if you really want long-term economic growth, I've got 2 grandchildren, Maggie, who's 10, and Robert, who's 8. And when they graduate someday, I'd like them to graduate into the most productive, most creative, most prosperous country in the world, which are the preconditions for being the safest country in the world. Well, if you think 10, 12 years down the road, then you had better be thinking about what is it going to take to compete with China and India. Because you're not going to be able to be the most competitive, most productive country in the world unless you benchmark China and India. They're going to be the great competitive engines of the next 30 years. And I think it was very interesting, symbolic. I don't know how many of you noticed last week, but last week China bought Volvo. And here's a Swedish company, makes a great car, and it's now a Chinese-Swedish company. Well, earlier, India, Tata, a big Indian company, bought Jaguar. And I thought it was symbolically interesting that you have the Jaguar is now an Indian company and Volvo is now a Chinese company. I thought it was kind of a signal to us to get awake. That if we really want to compete, then we need to benchmark China and India and make sure that we do the things necessary to be competitive. Now, I happen to believe in competition. I think competition is good at every level. I think competition in sports is good. I don't know how many of you watched the Final Four and watched Butler and Duke in what may have been one of the most exciting championship games we've seen in men's basketball. But, there are some people on the left who would argue that, Duke shouldn't be allowed to keep that trophy because, after all, Duke has gotten it before. And why should you allow Duke to have the trophy by itself? Shouldn't we be redistributing the trophy? Shouldn't each team that entered the Final Four be allowed, each of the Final Four gets to have the trophy for a month so that they can each display it? Because isn't it somehow wrong to allow a team, just because they won? All this stuff sounds a little familiar? Well, the same thing is true in dealing with China and India. I want America to compete, but frankly, I'm for the home team. I want America to compete and win. Now, if you're really serious about benchmarking China and India, a great place to start is a movie by Bob Compton called 2 Million Minutes. You can find it at 2mminutes.com. It's very compelling. Compton studies 2 Chinese, 2 Indian, and 2 American high school students. And at the end of this movie, you begin to realize how big the challenge is going to be in education. They study harder. They work longer, they're more serious, they have a much tougher, disciplined approach. Interestingly, though, Compton came back and did a second movie called 2 Million Minutes, The 21st Century Solution, which is actually the Basis High School in Tucson, Arizona, which he says may be the best high school in the world. And it's worth you looking at. And his argument is, it's not that we can't succeed. It's that we're currently not organized and incentivized and structured to succeed. So at American Solutions, as we did this analysis of China and India, we concluded that for America to be the most prosperous and the safest country in the world, we had to reform litigation, regulation, taxation, education, health, energy, and infrastructure. And that it literally takes that scale of reform to begin to really be able to compete head-to-head and win. And we thought it was so important to our children and grandchildren's future that that was really the driving force behind creating American Solutions. And so we're developing programs of reform across the whole system because we think that's the only way that you can really have us be the most successful country in the future. And it's obviously fundamentally different from the kind of big government, big bureaucracy, high tax, big litigation system that you see currently in Washington. Now, in the short run, in the immediate future, what we're recommending, and I recommend this to you to take a look at, we recommend 3 large sections. Reducing spending to balance the budget, 5 tax reforms that will help create jobs, and then an American energy plan. And I'd like to take just a minute to explain why we think each of the 3 matters. And by the way, we believe the American people will overwhelmingly support this approach. I think as people have watched the level of waste in government, their support for balancing the budget has gone up dramatically. As they think about $10 trillion in new debt, their desire to balance the budget has gone up dramatically. I think that people clearly understand that tax cuts are a better way to create jobs than government spending. And it's clear that people believe we ought to develop American energy, not rely on foreign energy. Now, there is a secular socialist machine which currently runs Washington and also runs Sacramento and runs Albany. They clearly don't care about any of this. And on every single count, they're on the wrong side. However, I want to remind you of a rule. People have always said elections have consequences. That's true. But they forget that the reverse is true. That is, consequences lead to elections. So the left has a very temporary moment in history when they have power in the House, the Senate, and the White House. I believe they are so grotesquely abusing it that this will be a blip in history. I think we will repeal virtually everything they did, and that by 2014 or 2015, they will be an interesting moment in history that woke the country up, got us to pay attention, and led us to decide what we needed was people who understood America. So let me take you through one step at a time. First of all, balancing the budget. Let me just assert for a second. You know, Ronald Reagan once in the 1992 convention gave a talk, and he said at one point, "I knew Thomas Jefferson." Well, I want to say in a similar tradition, I actually understand balancing the budget. We did it for 4 straight years. It's a fact. It's not a theory. So when people say to me, "Gosh, how would you balance the budget?" I start by pointing out to them that we did it. This is not magic. It's just hard work. I have a new book coming out called To Save America, and its subtitle is Stopping Obama's Secular Socialist Machine. And we have a chapter on balancing the budget. Let me tell you what the ground rules are. 1, don't spend. I mean, how many of you at some point in your life have had your children come in and tell you that they're having a really hard time, figuring out how to spend their budget because they wanted to have 3 more vacations than they could afford, and they wanted to eat out 4 more times than they could afford, and they wanted to buy clothing that was twice as expensive as they could afford, and they wondered what you thought the magic was to balancing their budget. And you had to explain to them, well, you start with the total amount you have, and you don't spend more than that. I mean, have any of you ever had this conversation? Am I making this up, or is this real life here? I mean, okay, so now we're a country. We're dealing with the family budget for government. You start with how much money will we have? Excuse me. Now, what you find pretty rapidly is we have a lot less money than Obama wants to spend. This is a very clear-cut question which you can put to the American people. Do you think the federal government should follow the same principle as a family budget or a small business? My guess is 80% of the country will say yes, because it just makes common sense and it makes moral sense. One of the reasons we were so much for a balanced budget when we did the contract with America is politicians who don't have to balance the budget can pay off every interest group because they have no natural priority. But if you say to them, you can only spend the amount you have, they suddenly have to learn to say no to people. And frankly, once you learn to say no to people, it gets easier. And so you begin to just say, well, we're not going to do this. But there's a deeper reason. We're doing at American Solutions right now 2 major project lines, one on corruption and the other on the degree to which government employee unions are fundamentally wasteful and destructive. Both of these are grounds that we just haven't plowed as a country. We haven't looked at. Let me start with corruption. At the Center for Health Transformation, we wrote a book called Stop Paying the Crooks. Now, I know it's bold, but here's what we found. The federal government, and this is what makes Obamacare so absurd, the federal government is such a bad manager that annually your federal government pays between $70 and $120 billion a year to crooks in Medicare and Medicaid. Now, I'm not talking about marginal mistakes by some doctor. I'm talking about 5 pizza parlors in Miami that were certified by Medicaid as HIV/AIDS transfusion centers. 5. I'm talking about the Russian mafia dominating durable medical equipment in Los Angeles. I'm talking about a couple that were picked up for stealing $76 million. And their answer was it was safer than dealing drugs, and therefore, and the prison terms aren't as long. I'm talking about a dentist in New York State who charged Medicaid for 983 procedures a day. I'm talking about a Brooklyn dental office that had somebody who stood out front and said, if you will loan us your Medicaid card for 30 seconds, we'll give you a free DVD player. I'm talking about an article this week in the New York Post, which talked about people who stood outside of subway entrances and got $10 a person for every person they got who agreed to go have their teeth cleaned for free. And then the dentist charged Medicaid for 4 or 5 procedures for that person. And it's just, then they actually had a van that came around and picked up, so they gathered up 5 or 10 people, they got in the van, they went and got their teeth cleaned. I mean, think about this. This is your tax money. This is a government so incompetent it can't find the crooks for a simple reason. All the government is paperwork, and they stop at 5. The crook has a BlackBerry, and they are willing to work after 5. You never catch up with the crook in this kind of a model. My favorite example, because it's so vivid, Kerry Weems, when he was the administrator of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and we were working on this level of corruption, he came to one of our center meetings and he said they had just found a doctor who had charged for 4 colonoscopies on the same person in one day. And my reaction was, I hope that that is fraud. But this kind of waste goes way beyond health care. New York City, there's an article in the New Yorker last August called The Rubber Room. New York City, because the union contract takes 7 years to fire a bad teacher. And New York City is a big system. So they have enough teachers who are too bad to be allowed with students, but they can't fire them, that they have rooms they sit in. They show up for work, they sit in the room doing nothing all day. They go home at the end of the day. The teachers who aren't allowed to teach cost New York City schools $50 million a year. And during the 7 years that they're not teaching but haven't yet been fired, they're increasing their pension by 2% a year. So you can get a 14% increase in your final pension while doing nothing for 7 years. Now, here's an example of what I think we have to pit American politics around. I want to say to the whole country, everybody who believes that $50 million should be spent helping poor children get a good education so they can go to prison, so they can go to college and not go to prison. You're with us. Everybody believes we ought to take care of the union with the $50 million for bad teachers, even if it means children will go to prison instead of college. You're with them. Now let's see how the country divides. My guess is it'll be 85 or 90% in favor of the kids and against paying the bad people. And we ought, again, notice I'm being judgmental. If you're a person who's been told you cannot teach, and you are taking the money for doing nothing, that is morally wrong. And we ought to have the nerve to say, that's wrong. Don't tell me about the legalities. Don't tell me about the contract. That's just wrong. And we need to go back. If we're going to get this country back on the right track, we have to go back to right and wrong. Now let me give you one other example so you understand how pervasive this is. The New York Times, hardly a paragon of right-wingism, did a story this year that the Long Island Railroad, in the last decade, 97% of their retirees went on disability. Now, do any of you believe 97% of their retirees were disabled? Of course not. It's called theft. But everybody does it, so why not do it? Because that's why you get more money. And why not get the more money? Because if you were honest, you wouldn't get the money, and since it doesn't matter and everybody does it, you might as well get the money. Well, this is why the country's sick. By the way, the Long Island Railroad alone cost $250 million to federal taxpayers in the last decade for disability payments. That's why this is real. You just add one at a time. Now, we believe in American solutions, and we'd love to have your help in popularizing that the easy way to capture this new logic of controlling spending is the term 2 + 2 = 4. And we're going to put out signs from American Solutions. I know it's bold and it's right at the edge. But I want to slow down the debate. I want to slow down the argumentation. I don't want the left dancing around us making 612 allegations. I want to slow them down and say, okay, is the health bill 2,700 pages or not? Does the health bill cost $1 trillion or not? Does the health bill create 159 new offices, commissions, or not? And does anybody really believe a federal government which is paying $70 to $120 billion to crooks in Medicare and Medicaid is going to be able to run the entire national health system? Or do you think it's going to be a giant mess? And I think the more we slow the conversation down, the harder it is for the left to hide. And I think 2 + 2 = 4 is important also because Camus wrote in his novel The Plague, there are times when a man can be killed for saying 2 + 2 = 4 because the authorities can't stand the truth. And I think if you watch Congressman Henry Waxman's reaction to AT&T announcing that the health bill was going to cost $1 billion, and Waxman was angry that they would say it, and he wants to bring them in and browbeat them, he's the perfect example of what Camus was writing about. A man of power who now wants to bully and demagogue, worthy of Hugo Chavez, but not an American model. In the American model, members of Congress ought to actually respect and listen to the public, not browbeat, bully, and dominate. So our first goal is, let's reform the government, let's cut spending, let's control spending, let's start back to a balanced budget. And frankly, given the size of the increase in this government in the last 2 years, I think you could take $1 trillion out of it and the country would be better off. Now, remember, that also then sends a signal to state government, sends a signal to local government. This is going to be a period of government frugality, and there's a very practical reason. Government is the fourth bubble. The first bubble was information technology in '99. The second bubble was housing in 2007. The third bubble was Wall Street. You look at the total size of government spending, state, federal, and local, it's clearly unsustainable. And the question is, do we have the wisdom as a people to insist that our government come under control before there's a real crisis? Or like Greece, are we going to wait until the debt is so great, the interest expense is so great, the economy is so weak, that we're coerced by reality? Excuse me. I think it is irresponsible for us to walk past this reality and fail to do our job. And so I think getting government under control at every level, the local school board, city council, county commission, state legislature, federal government, we have to take on the challenge of reducing the size of government, reducing the burden of government, and getting back to a much more decentralized private sector, voluntary sector, local system without Washington trying to micromanage everything in the whole country. The second question is tax policy. And here I do start from my background as a person who runs small businesses. You know, you either send a signal in the tax code that you want to favor work, you want to favor savings, you want to favor job creation, or you send a signal in the tax code that you want to punish the successful. You want to increase the risk of hiring somebody. Now, clearly what modern big government does is it sends a signal to not invest. It sends a signal to not hire more people. It sends a signal to not create new businesses. If you take the cost of Sarbanes-Oxley, and we've talked about this now for a decade, the Sarbanes-Oxley bill, which was a dramatic overreach after Enron, a dramatic overreach, has basically killed venture capital and startups because it's just made it too expensive. Bernie Marcus, who helped found Home Depot, has said publicly, he couldn't found Home Depot today. We've made it too expensive. You look at our tax code. Our tax code punishes you if you're successful, punishes you if you invest, punishes you if you create jobs, because all your costs go up. This new health bill is going to add to the punishment. This potential energy tax increase that they want to pass is going to add to the punishment. We had a meeting in Akron with a group of small businesses, and all of them in Ohio were worried that if the government raised the price of energy, that their businesses would all end up going to China. And so you've really got to look at what should we be doing. So we have a series of very specific tax proposals. I believe if you really wanted to jumpstart the economy, because small business is so important to creating jobs, that the number one thing you ought to do is have a 2-year, 50% reduction in the Social Security and Medicare tax, both for the individual and for every small business, every business. Now, what that would do overnight is, first of all, it would say to every American, well, we can't get you an increase in gross pay. We are going to increase your take-home pay. And you're going to have a little bit more money to pay off debt, a little bit more money to save up and make up for any losses you may have had, and life will be marginally better, and we'll make it more desirable to work, because you get to keep more of your own money. The second thing we'll do is say to every business, you take half the cost of Social Security and Medicare for the next 2 years, and we're making you much less dependent on bank loans and much less dependent on outside financing, and giving you the ability to increase your own financing with your own cash flow. That increases the chance to hire new people and lowers the cost of hiring them. During the 2 years, we'd have the 50% reduction. And by the way, for the first time, every American would know how much they were paying, because they would now see it. We would have a real reform effort on the entitlement programs, because I believe for younger Americans, we have to move towards a defined contribution, long-term build-up through interest program. And we just need to say, the Social Security model of 1935, when you had, the first year we paid Social Security checks, there were 42 workers for every person getting a check. For my grandchildren, they're going to be down to 2 to 1. You can't sustain income distribution programs at 2 to 1. And so I want my grandchildren to have the right to put their money into their account, which they build up, which they control, and no politician controls. And over their working lifetime, they will actually have 2 or 3 times as much savings as they're going to have in the current model. The second thing we would do is create 100% write-off for new investment in new productive equipment. So in 1 year's time, if you went out and bought something that made your workers more productive, made yourself more productive if you're self-employed, you could write the whole cost off. There's a very practical reason for doing this. We're living in an age of enormous scientific and technological change. We want American workers, if we're going to compete with China and India, and we're going to maintain our standard of living, our workers have to be the most productive in the world. If we're going to be the most productive in the world, we need to be able to modernize constantly and get new equipment and get the best equipment and be able to constantly give our workers a chance to compete with the best possible capability. That will also dramatically increase the American machine tool industry and rebuild our own home capability to provide this kind of equipment. The third thing we would do is take a lesson from the Chinese. Every time somebody who's a liberal tells you that they want to compete with China and they're worried about jobs in China, challenge them with the following single fact. The Chinese have zero capital gains tax. Now, I think if we had zero capital gains tax in the United States, the level of investment you would see in this country would explode. But notice this is a fundamentally different model. Instead of worrying about protectionism and worrying about stopping the Chinese, I'm worrying about accelerating the Americans and increasing our competitiveness. You know, I want other countries to worry about us competing with them. I don't want us to hide and be afraid of other countries. So zero capital gains becomes a big part of this. The fourth thing we would do is we'd learn a lesson from Ireland. The United States today has the highest, when you combine state and federal, we have the highest corporate tax rate in the world. Second highest in federal only, but when you add state taxes, we're the highest corporate tax rate in the world. It's like putting a runner in a race and putting 60 pounds on their back. I think if we matched Ireland, which has a 12.5% rate, we would explode. And by the way, at 12.5%, we would repatriate from overseas hundreds of billions of dollars that are currently locked up overseas, because you'd be stupid. If you were a corporation and you were told, why don't you bring the money home so the U.S. government can take it? We literally had somebody today, this was fascinating. We had somebody today who works in a company that employs 35,000 people, 23,000 in the United States. 5 years ago, they moved their corporate headquarters to Switzerland. He said it was entirely driven by the tax rate. Now, for us to have a tax code which drives companies out of the U.S., drives jobs out of the U.S., cripples us in international competition, and then have the president have this, he's going to have this big export effort. Well, if he wants a big export effort, I got two simple steps, or three steps. 100% write-off of new equipment, zero capital gains, 12.5% corporate tax rate. And if he's serious, we have a way to, boy, within a year, we'd be the most dynamic economy on the planet. But we'd be the most dynamic because 2 + 2 = 4. We'd actually have a math we could show you that you will be better off creating your newest factory in the U.S., hiring Americans and putting your investment in the U.S. And you'll be better off in a practical dollar and cents way. And I don't mind telling people, the truth is, if you want to get businesses excited, give them a chance to make money. Our friends on the left seem to think making money is bad, unless, of course, you're a trial lawyer or a movie star. I think you have to be honest about what motivates businesses. They're actually in business. By the way, the American people get this. CBS News asked the question, which do you think is more effective at job creation? Cutting business taxes or government spending? By 59 to 21, they picked cutting business taxes. I think it's important for us to understand. We can have this conversation with the American people. The secular socialist machine in Washington and Sacramento and Albany may not get it, but the people who elect them may. And if the people who elect them get it, they're going to replace the people who don't get it. This is why Ronald Reagan used to say his job was to show the light to the American people so they would turn up the heat on Congress. I think the people actually could rally to a program of this kind. The fifth piece we have is equally important, and that is we believe that you need an American energy program to use American energy to keep American dollars at home. Now, I realize describing this in New Orleans, where you directly understand the importance of oil and gas production, is pretty easy. But the amazing thing is, almost everywhere in the country, people get it. When we did a survey for American Solutions, 79% of the country said they thought that we ought to have an American energy program, that they thought it was dangerous to rely on foreign dictators, and they thought it was dangerous for our economy to be subject to blackmail. And so at American Solutions, we're developing a very aggressive program. We did a movie called We Have the Power, and we did a book called Drill Here, Drill Now, Pay Less. But we don't just talk about oil and gas. We outline nuclear, we outline clean coal, we outline biofuels, we look at wind and solar. The potential, the United States may have more energy than any other country in the world. And the idea that we don't, we're spending $400 or $500 billion a year buying foreign energy. Well, I'd rather have all that money stay in the U.S. I'd like to have the next building boom be in St. Louis rather than in the Middle East. And that just requires changing government policy. Our current energy problems are entirely a function of government. They're not a function of geography. They're not a function of possibilities. They're because you have bad government policies forcing bad behaviors. So we have a model: control spending, move to a balanced budget, fundamentally change the tax code to favor jobs, investment, and create an American energy program based on American capabilities. We think those things would lead to a boom, and that you would in fact be able to get back to full employment much faster than the St. Petersburg paper predicts. But it does require very dramatic, very fundamental change in the politicians and a willingness to go out and elect people who are committed to these kind of new models. And that means, in my judgment, you want to look at state legislators, you want to look at city and county and local governments, you also want to look at Congress and governorships, and you want to look in both parties. I mean, I would love to find a candidate against Henry Waxman in a Democratic primary. He's in a very Democratic seat, but my hunch is he could get beaten in a Democratic primary because his arrogance is so insufferable. But you'll never beat him in a general election because it's too Democratic a district. So I think we have to have a whole new attitude of saying we want to recruit American citizens, whether they're Democrats or Republicans or independents, and get them engaged across the whole system. Let me toss it open for, we'd love to have comments, conversations. I think Adam has got a microphone, or they may have several microphones actually. Okay, we have at least 2 microphones coming up. So if you'd like to say, either have a comment or whatever you'd like to talk about, feel free. This is your part of the program.
The issues that you spoke of earlier, very laudable about the waste and Medicaid, Medicare, and so forth. If it was in your grasp right now to make the necessary changes, what would you do to correct that?
Well, we at the Center for Health Transformation, which you can see at healthtransformation.net, we actually outline a whole range of those kind of changes. I mean, one of the steps, frankly, would be to go to an all-electronic health record system, because if you look at your credit card, which is electronic, we keep fraud in credit cards, excuse me, below 0.2%. Fraud in Medicare and Medicaid, which is paper-based, is above 10%. Excuse me. So the difference is when you go, and all of you know this, when you go and use your credit card, even for something as simple as getting gasoline or an automatic teller machine or buying something at a local store, there are expert systems that analyze that purchase and immediately respond. And so this is why some of you, how many of you have ever had a call that said, did you actually do X, because they were checking to see whether or not, raise your hand, I mean, look around the room. Okay. Now, if the same thing happens in healthcare, they audit the paper 6 months later. Well, what the crooks have learned is you set up a shop, you charge a couple $1 million, you take the checks, and by the time they're ready to audit you, you close it. And you go set up a new shop. So the bureaucracy never catches up. It's very rare for the bureaucracy to catch up with them. So the number one thing, if you want to stop fraud, I believe, is to go to an all-electronic system so that you have a real-time flow of information so you can then have expert systems. We know how to do all that. We just, because the government dominates health, we don't do it in healthcare. Yes, sir. Wait a second. She's going to bring you your mic again.
As a follow-up on that, what I was really hoping to hear from you is to say there's no constitutional basis for our federal government to be involved in health care whatsoever. If they weren't involved in that, you wouldn't have to control fraud.
Well, I mean, you could say that, but let me just say that even for somebody who's as aggressive as I am, to try to figure out a short-term solution, which means not having Medicare or Medicaid, is, I think, a pretty gigantic jump from where we are. And I think you can migrate towards that. I favor migrating towards it, but I don't think you're going to get there in the next 3 to 5 years. And so in 3 to 5 years, there's somewhere between 210 and $600 billion in theft. So part of what I'd like to do is get the system to be honest while you're debating how you're going to reshape it. I mean, we do have it. We've published several books. I published a book called Saving Lives and Saving Money in 2002. We published a book called Paper Kills and a book I mentioned earlier called Stop Paying the Crooks. And we have published a whole series of papers on how you would dramatically rethink and reform the system. And in the long run, I think you want to gradually get the government out of Medicare and Medicaid, but I think it's a very long process. And you have to recognize that seniors generally like Medicare. So you can't go out and threaten to eliminate it because you frankly guarantee that you won't be politically viable. But seniors, for example, really like Medicare Advantage, which gave them a lot more choices. And this administration, of course, is deeply against Medicare Advantage because there's a good centralized bureaucracy. They don't believe you ought to be making choices. And that's why, if you look at seniors have been very opposed. They've been the most opposed group to Obamacare around the country.
Newt?
Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for being here today. I do applaud your program that 2 + 2 = 4. My observation is that you might be losing some people with that concept. You might want to go to 1 + 1 = 2. I do have a serious question for you. Back in the 80s, there was the investment tax credit, which in our business, when I was just starting out as a young engineer and working for my company, we had tremendous success in getting complex technology adopted with the investment tax credit vis-a-vis leases, et cetera. That was discontinued, I believe, in the 80s. And it has been resurrected in a rather weak form, I think, in the form of energy programs, as it's very specifically targeted. Has your American Solutions investigator considered what might be the positive consequences of reinstitution of a expanded investment tax credit for the American economy?
Yeah. We haven't. That's a good idea, and I'll make sure that Adam takes that back to the team that works on tax policy at Solutions. Part of our reasoning was if you went to 100% expensing and you could write off any investment in 1 year, that you had such a huge advantage doing that you didn't need to worry about the investment tax credit. I'd like that, but we should actually go back to a couple of tax lawyers and accountants and have them actually run the numbers and see if that's technically right. But I think the net advantage of writing it off in 1 year is so huge that if we went to that model, that you wouldn't have to worry much about an investment tax credit. But we'll run the numbers. That's a very good question.
Oh, we appreciate you coming down here, Speaker Gingrich. A couple things you mentioned over with him about you would eventually want to migrate towards eliminating Medicare and other unconstitutional areas such as Social Security. But we're not seeing a real plan put in place by anybody saying this is what we're going to do, where people talk about, oh, we're going to run it more responsibly. We're not actually seeing anybody say this is how we're going to eliminate it. And it seems like it can be done. Well, you can always transfer Medicare and Medicaid over to the states who have less overhead cost than the federal government. Therefore, the federal government doesn't have to tax you as much, and the states can pick up that burden. And that within a couple of years transferring it, you can have the federal government out of that. Social Security, you can have anybody, you increase the retirement age for Social Security. You say anybody within 5 years of that is going to get their benefits no matter what. They've been lied to all these years about being constitutional, and they're going to get those things, so you can't take away from them, obviously. But anybody who say within more than 10 years or 20 years away from retirement, having kind of a phased out system in place where if you're more than 20 years away from retirement, you're not going to pay anything into Social Security. That money's going to come out of the regular budget, forcing them, because they're doing it anyways, they're just moving Social Security funds into the regular budget. So everybody else just have an automatic 401k set up where it has an employer match, and just you're replacing Social Security with that for the younger people. It seems like a simple enough plan, but...
Sure. A couple of points. First of all, Paul Ryan, who is the congressman from Wisconsin, who's the ranking member of the Budget Committee, has actually published a pretty detailed book of how he would deal with the entitlement programs. And I think it's called the roadmap. But if you contact Congressman Ryan's office, he's a very, very serious, thoughtful person and a very courageous person. And it's I find it a fairly daunting read, but it is nonetheless a very serious effort in the direction you're talking about. In our new book, To Save America, Peter Ferrara and I have a section on a fundamental transition which would really take you to a personal Medicare account and a personal retirement Social Security account. And I want to distinguish this from privatizing. It would still be we would still have a system where you had to save the money. So it's a mandatory program, because I frankly don't want to have 20 and 30-year-olds decide not to save and then be shocked at 55 or 60 and and throw themselves on the community. But I want them to have the fruit of their savings. And Peter makes the argument, and has pretty good backing from a number of economists, that if you started when you first went to work, that the power of compound interest over time, the buildup you get on your savings is such that you actually can buy the equivalent of Medicare when you retire and have a very, very big saving, have 2 or 3 times the level of saving you'll get out of Social Security and be able to afford Medicare. And Peter Ferrara, you may want to contact, is really smart about this stuff. Well, those are good questions. Yes, sir, down here. Well, you and then we'll come down here. No, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Speaker Gingrich. Back when you were a speaker, my buddy and I, we wrote software for the providers to get every nickel they could out of the state and federal government. So, but a few years ago, we switched and we did the expert systems where we could detect the overpayments, and we can get private businesses, but we can't get government to listen to us. Through a FOIA request, we found over $500 million with TRICARE, and they won't return our phone calls. So, yeah. I mean...
Actually, if you'll talk to Adam later on, I'd love to get you in touch with Jim Frogue, who does this for us at the Center for Health Transformation. We'd love to pursue that with you.
That'd be great.
We find the same experience over and over again. New York State, clearly, according to the New York Times, has more than 10% pure fraud. That's over $4 billion a year. The New York Post just did this really embarrassing article this last week. Nobody in Albany cares about it, because if you're a secular socialist machine, you don't particularly care about fraud. I mean, fraud is just part of the price of big government. And so it's really amazing how much they are indifferent to throwing away your money paying the crooks. Good. And Adam, if you could bring the microphone down to this, right in the front row. Okay. No. Okay, she's already got it.
All right.
Thank you. 2
things, actually. One, with respect to the repatriation of corporate funds that are offshore, the problem, and you may put a lot of safeguards in it, but to be candid, the political whores in Washington may say yes this year, and then next year it's the one-finger salute, and then they're back to 35% or whatever. So the problem really is that Washington can't be trusted at all. And so that unless you have safeguards built in for at least a 10-year holiday or a 20, I mean, something, those boys and girls
But if you cut the corporate tax rate to 12.5%, you'd have changed the entire equation.
Yes, you'll get the money back, but then year 2, when the Kenyan decides, well, we need more money, it'll be back up to 35%. So, I mean, they just can't be trusted. So any repatriation law would have to require 75%, I don't know, 100%. Anyway, that was 1. 2, and this may be outside your bailiwick. I think it was Friday or tomorrow, a week ago, a woman named Kim Strassel, who writes in the Wall Street Journal, wrote an article. I can't remember the headline, but it was during the reconciliation issue, and where I can remember one example, but anyway, a number of amendments were offered to the bill, and the one amendment that springs readily to mind was to rescind the ability of pedophiles in prison to receive Viagra. Now, that sounds pretty straightforward. It was voted down, of course, because every pedophile needs his Viagra. And she proposed, though, that a matrix be drawn so that the proposal be listed, and then what congressman or senator or whatever it was voted for or against, and use that as a mechanism to, with all due respect to one of my own senators, she voted, of course, with the majority, and that would be used as a political hammer to go after some of these ne'er-do-wells and use that as a vehicle to get them out of office. But I don't know whether that would be in your bailiwick, whether you would ever construct some kind of matrix.
That's really interesting. I will go back and raise that issue.
Kim Strassel is her name.
Okay, yeah, if we can, Adam, if you or Whitney or somebody could just remind me or get the data from him, I'd like to see that article, and then I think we may pursue that. Yeah, and of course what happened, just for all of you, what happened is the Democrats got together and decided they agreed they would vote no on every amendment no matter what they were, which of course meant the Republicans could have a field day of then designing amendments that that made you look so incredibly stupid for voting no that they were indefensible. And I think but where I think Republicans tend to fail is communicating it is 99% of the fight. It's a little bit like Edison once said that genius was 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Sometimes these kind of things are 99% communication and 1% substance. And if you don't do the 99%, the 1% didn't exist. So we'll track that down. That's very good. That's helpful.